The streets of Harlem never truly slept. Even in the early hours before dawn, when most of the city exhaled and sank into silence, Harlem remained alert, listening, watching, remembering. In the winter of 1934, the cold cut sharper than usual, and men learned quickly that darkness here was not empty. It was occupied. Ellsworth, Bumpy, Johnson understood this better than anyone alive. He stood by the window of his brownstone office on West 131st Street, coat still on, hat resting on the desk behind him. Below, the streetlights painted the pavement a sickly yellow. Snow had begun to fall, slow, deliberate flakes, like the city itself was taking its time deciding what would survive the night. Bumpy didn't move. He had learned long ago that stillness unnerved men more than threats ever could. Across the country, in a city built on blood and ambition, another man had reached a decision of his own. Al Capone did not like being told no, and Bumpy Johnson had just done exactly that. Chicago, Illinois, 3 days earlier. The room smelled of cigar smoke and polished wood. Heavy curtains sealed the office off from daylight, and the only sound was the slow tick of an expensive clock on the wall. Capone sat behind his desk, jacket off, sleeves rolled, thick fingers drumming against the surface like a man counting down. The messenger stood stiff in front of him, eyes fixed forward. He said, "Harlem isn't for sale," the man muttered. Said, "Your trucks don't cross his streets. Ever." The room went quiet. Capone stopped drumming. "Say that again," he said calmly. The messenger swallowed. He said, "If Chicago tries to move product through Harlem, there won't be anyone left to send messages back." Capone leaned back in his chair. For a moment, it almost looked like he was amused. Then he laughed, low, sharp, humorless. "Harlem," he said, shaking his head. "A neighborhood full of jazz players and numbers runners thinks it can shut the door on me." No one answered. They knew better. Capone stood up slowly and walked toward the window. Outside, Chicago moved like a machine. Factories, railroads, men who did what they were told because not doing it got you buried. "I didn't build this empire by letting local bosses bark at me," he said. "And I sure as hell won't let some Harlem dandy embarrass me." He turned back to the room. "I want Johnson gone," Capone said flatly. "I don't care how many it takes." A man near the door cleared his throat. "Bumpy Johnson's protected. Harlem's not like the rest. People there, they don't talk." Capone smiled thinly. "Then we'll send enough men that talking won't matter." He reached for a folder on his desk and opened it. 30, he said. 30 proven men. No rookies. No drunks. No mistakes. The room shifted uneasily. 30 hitmen wasn't a warning. It was an extermination order. Harlem felt the ripple before the storm arrived. Bumpy Johnson heard about it from 3 different mouths before the sun rose the next morning. A dock worker who suddenly vanished. A bartender who noticed unfamiliar faces asking too many questions. A woman who cleaned offices downtown and overheard names she wasn't supposed to hear. Chicago was moving, and not quietly. Bumpy sat at his desk, hands folded, listening as his Lieutenant Dutch Schultz, no relation to the New York mobster, paced the room. 30 men, Bumpy, Dutch said. "That's not a hit. That's a war party." Bumpy finally turned. "How many did Capone send after Luciano when he crossed him?" Bumpy asked. Dutch frowned. 12. "And how many came back?" 4. Bumpy nodded once. Then Capone scared. Dutch stopped pacing. "Scared? You don't send 30 men unless you're afraid of one," Bumpy said. "That tells me everything I need to know." Dutch hesitated. "What do you want to do?" Bumpy stood up, walked to the coat rack, and put on his hat. "Nothing," he said. "We don't chase ghosts. We let them come." The first of Capone's men entered Harlem just after midnight. They didn't come together. That was the plan. Small groups, different streets, different hotels. Some came by train, others by car, a few by bus. They blended in as best as white men from Chicago could blend into a neighborhood that noticed everything. They carried pistols, knives, wire, and confidence. That confidence lasted less than an hour. The first group disappeared near Lenox Avenue. No shots, no screams, just silence. The second never made it out of their hotel. The desk clerk would later swear they went upstairs and never came back down. The third managed to call Chicago. Static crackled over the line. Breathing. Panic. We're being watched, the voice whispered. They know every move. The line went dead. By dawn, half of the 30 were gone. No bodies found. No witnesses willing to speak. Harlem closed ranks the way only Harlem could. Bumpy Johnson sat in his office, sipping coffee, listening to reports delivered quietly, efficiently. He didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He waited, because Capone hadn't sent 30 men to scare him. He had sent them to send a message. And Bumpy Johnson intended to send one back. 2 nights later, a single man staggered into a Chicago rail station. His coat was torn. His face was bruised beyond recognition. One eye swollen shut. His hands shook so badly he dropped his ticket twice before managing to hold on to it. People stared. He didn't notice. All he did was whisper one sentence to anyone who got too close. Don't go to Harlem. By the time he reached Capone's office, he could barely stand. Capone took one look at him and knew. Where are the others? Capone asked. The man opened his mouth and began to cry. The man who returned from Harlem collapsed onto the leather chair in Capone's office like a corpse that hadn't yet realized it was dead. 2 guards moved to help him. Capone raised a hand. Leave us. They hesitated. One look at Capone's face settled it. The door closed softly behind them, sealing the room in cigar smoke and silence. Capone circled the survivor slowly, the way a butcher studies an animal before deciding where to cut. You walked into Harlem with 29 other men, Capone said evenly. You're sitting here alone. The man's lips trembled. His eyes refused to meet Capone's. What happened? Capone asked. The survivor swallowed hard. They didn't rush us, he said hoarsely. That's what scared me. Capone stopped pacing. Explain. They watched first, the man said. Every bar, every doorway, every alley. We felt it, like eyes on the back of your skull. We'd turn around. Nothing there. But they were always there. Capone leaned against the desk. You're telling me 30 trained men got spooked by shadows? The man shook his head violently. No, we got erased by professionals. He paused, breathing uneven. They knew our names, he whispered. They knew where we slept, who we talked to, what we ordered to drink. One of the guys, Frankie, he got pulled aside by a shoeshine boy who called him by his real name. Capone's expression hardened. That's impossible. That's Harlem, the man said. Capone said nothing. The survivor continued, voice cracking. They never killed in crowds. Never made noise. 1 second a man was next to you. The next he was just gone. Doors opened that weren't there before. Hands came out of nowhere. Alleyways swallowed people whole. He rubbed his wrists unconsciously. They tied some of them up, he added. Not to torture, to talk. Capone straightened. Talk about what? About Chicago, the man said. Routes. Names. Who answers to you? Who doesn't? Capone's jaw clenched. And you? He asked. Why are you breathing? The survivor finally looked up. Because Ellsworth, Bumpy, Johnson wanted you to hear something. The room went cold. Capone stared at him. What did Johnson say? The survivor swallowed again. He said to look you in the eye when I told you this, he said. So I'm trying. But it's hard. Capone leaned forward slowly. Say it. The man took a breath. He said, tell Capone Harlem is not Chicago. Your men walk loud. Mine don't walk at all. Silence. The clock ticked. Capone's face didn't move, but something behind his eyes shifted. There's more, the survivor whispered. Capone didn't blink. Go on, he said. If you send another man, I won't send anyone back. Not even a message. The survivor's voice dropped to almost nothing. And then he said, I'll let this one live so you'd know I could have killed him in 10 different ways, and chose not to. Capone straightened slowly. For the first time since the beginning of his rise, Al Capone didn't speak immediately. Across the country, Harlem moved on as if nothing had happened. Jazz clubs filled. Dice rolled on sidewalks. Storefronts opened at dawn. Children ran through the streets laughing, unaware that 30 men had come to erase their neighborhood and vanished instead. Bumpy Johnson walked through it all like a man who had already measured his shadow and found it long enough. His lieutenant Dutch fell into step beside him. Chicago won't like this, Dutch said quietly. Bumpy didn't slow. They already made their choice, he replied. Now they live with it. Dutch hesitated. You really think Capone backs off? Bumpy stopped and turned. Capone understands power, he said. Not pride. He just learned Harlem has more of the first than he expected. Dutch nodded, but his face was tight. And if he wants revenge? Bumpy smiled faintly. Then he'll have to come himself, he said. And men like Capone don't like dying where no one remembers them. In Chicago, Capone dismissed the survivor with a wave of his hand. The man didn't thank him. He didn't need to. As the door closed, Capone poured himself a drink and stared into the glass longer than usual. 30 men. Gone. No headlines. No bodies. Nowhere he could point to. Just absence. And absence was something Capone couldn't fight. He took a slow sip, then set the glass down untouched. Harlem, he muttered. For the first time in years, Al Capone chose restraint. Not because he wanted peace, but because he had just learned where his reach ended. Word doesn't travel fast in the underworld. It travels carefully. By the time Al Capone decided not to retaliate, the decision had already been felt in places he'd never stepped foot in again. Men noticed shipments rerouted without explanation. Meetings postponed indefinitely. Phones that once rang with orders now stayed silent. No announcement was made. None was needed. The absence of violence was the message. In New York, the 5 families took note. So did the Irish mobs, the Jewish syndicates, the independents who lived between allegiances like rats between walls. Everyone asked the same question in private, never out loud. What happened in Harlem? The answer came back the same every time. 30 went in. 1 came out. Chicago blinked. That was all anyone needed to hear. Ellsworth, Bumpy, Johnson never claimed credit. That was the brilliance of it. He didn't leak stories. He didn't brag through intermediaries. He didn't even allow his own men to exaggerate what had happened. Harlem's silence became its armor. When people don't know how you did something, they assume the worst. And fear fills in details better than facts ever could. Bumpy understood something most bosses never did. Power wasn't about how hard you struck. It was about who decided not to swing back. Capone's restraint turned Harlem into a myth. And myths are dangerous to challenge. The next move wasn't violence. It was economics. Within weeks, Chicago-backed suppliers quietly stopped pushing for routes through Harlem. They didn't explain why. They simply adjusted. That left a vacuum. One Bumpy filled immediately. Local operators were offered protection without pressure. Numbers runners were allowed to work freely as long as disputes stayed off the streets. Clubs were left alone if they paid on time. If they didn't, they weren't burned or shot. They were isolated. Musicians stopped playing there. Suppliers stopped delivering. Patrons found other doors open, and this one closed. No blood. Just disappearance. The same thing that happened to Capone's men. Bumpy's Lieutenant Dutch finally understood the scope of it one night, standing on a rooftop overlooking Harlem. You didn't beat Capone, Dutch said quietly. You made him irrelevant. Bumpy didn't answer right away. Below them, the neighborhood breathed. Laughter spilling from clubs, taxis honking, life continuing uninterrupted. I didn't need to beat him, Bumpy said. I needed him to learn. Dutch glanced at him. Learn what? That some places don't belong to outsiders, Bumpy said. And some men don't need to raise their voice to be heard. In Chicago, Al Capone read reports he never asked for. Harlem was flagged in red ink. No operations. No contacts. No contingencies. It sat there on the page like a scar. Capone didn't tear it out. He closed the folder and locked it away. Because removing it wouldn't change the truth. He could crush cities. But Harlem had made itself expensive. And Capone knew better than to overpay. The survivor, the only man to walk back out, was never the same. He quit the life within a year. Took a job on the docks under a different name. Drank too much. Talked too little. When asked about Chicago, he shrugged. When asked about New York, he stiffened. And when someone joked about Harlem, he left the room. Because he remembered what the rest of the world never saw. Men disappearing without noise. Eyes watching without faces. A boss who didn't threaten, he decided. By the end of the decade, Harlem had a reputation no money could buy. It wasn't neutral territory. It wasn't contested. It was closed. Deals were made around it, not through it. Wars were planned with it in mind, like a wall you didn't try to breach because you didn't know how deep it went. All because one man sent 30 killers. and another man sent back one witness. People outside Harlem made one fatal mistake when they tried to understand what happened. They assumed Ellsworth, Bumpy, Johnson had won through brute force. That assumption was comforting because brute force could be countered. What they failed to see was that the 30 men Capone sent never really fought Harlem. They fought a system, and systems don't bleed. Bumpy Johnson did not rule Harlem like a king. He ruled it like an engineer. Every street had a function. Every block had a rhythm. Every person, whether they knew it or not, was part of an information loop. Shoeshine boys, barbers, doormen, church ladies, jazz musicians who played until sunrise and slept through the afternoon. None of them were soldiers. That was the genius. Soldiers attract attention. Communities don't. When Capone's men arrived, Harlem didn't see outsiders. It saw anomalies. Men who didn't belong to the rhythm. Shoes too clean. Eyes too busy. Questions asked a second too late or a second too early. That data moved faster than any telephone line. By the time the first Chicago hitman ordered a drink, 3 people already knew his face didn't fit the room. By the time he finished it, someone else knew his name. Bumpy never issued written orders. He didn't have to. Instructions were embedded into habit. If a bartender wiped the counter twice instead of once, it meant a stranger was listening. If a street vendor packed up early, it meant a route was compromised. If music stopped abruptly in a club, it wasn't a technical issue. It was a signal. Capone's men were trained to spot guns. They weren't trained to read culture. That gap killed them. The disappearances followed a pattern no outsider could decode. Some men vanished near churches, others near gambling houses, a few near vacant buildings that had no record of ownership. Each location served a different purpose. Interrogation didn't happen in basements with chains and screams. It happened in kitchens, back rooms, and quiet apartments where coffee was still warm. Bumpy believed torture made men lie. Conversation made them talk. He already knew most of what he needed before they opened their mouths. Names, routes, objectives. The rest was confirmation. Once a man was confirmed as part of Capone's operation, his fate was decided swiftly. No public executions. No warnings to the police. No mess. Harlem did not punish. It absorbed. By the time Capone understood what he was facing, it was too late to adjust. You can bribe cops. You can intimidate politicians. You can flood a city with guns. But you cannot rush a neighborhood that has decided it will outlast you. Capone's power relied on visibility, on reputation reinforced by spectacle. Bumpy's relied on inevitability. That difference mattered. A meeting took place weeks later in New York between representatives of the 5 families. No one invited Harlem. No one needed to. The question on the table was simple. What happens if someone challenges Johnson? The answer came from an older man who had survived more wars than most. You won't know you've challenged him, he said. You'll just notice things stop working. Routes dry up. Contacts disappear. Allies suddenly become unavailable. And then you'll realize you're alone. That understanding reshaped organized crime in New York. Harlem became a fixed variable, like weather or geography. You didn't negotiate with it. You planned around it. Bumpy Johnson didn't just protect his territory. He redefined what territory meant. It wasn't lines on a map. It was trust, routine, and memory. Things outsiders never had time to build. Late one night, Dutch asked the question everyone else was afraid to voice. What if someone smarter than Capone comes along? Bumpy considered it carefully. Then they'll do what Capone did, he said. They'll stop. Dutch frowned. That's it. That's everything, Bumpy replied. Smart men don't die for pride. The truth was simple, and that simplicity terrified people. Harlem wasn't defended by walls or armies. It was defended by belonging, and no amount of money could buy that overnight. 30 men tried. Only one lived long enough to understand why. History remembers Al Capone as a man brought down by tax evasion. That's the version taught because it's clean, legal, safe. But men inside the underworld knew the truth. Capone didn't fall in court first. He fell in influence. And that slide began the night Harlem refused him. After the Harlem incident, Capone was still feared, but fear without expansion is a slow death. His empire had been built on momentum. Every year, new territory, new routes, new leverage. Now, there was a hard stop on the map. And worse, it wasn't enforced by another syndicate. It was enforced by one man in a neighborhood that didn't answer phones. That unnerved people. Lieutenants began hedging. Allies started diversifying. Meetings that once centered on Capone now ended with quiet side conversations afterward. Nothing disloyal, just cautious. Capone noticed. He always did. Chicago began tightening inward. Less ambition, more control. That was a defensive posture, and defense was not Capone's strength. Meanwhile, in New York, something unusual happened. The five families stopped arguing over Harlem entirely. It wasn't because they'd agreed. It was because they'd accepted reality. Ellsworth, Bumpy, Johnson was no longer seen as a variable. He was a condition. Bumpy didn't expand either. That confused people even more. No push into Brooklyn. No attempt to absorb neighboring territories. No grand declarations. He stayed exactly where he was. And that restraint made him impossible to provoke. Ambitious bosses burn bright and die fast. Bumpy burned low and steady. Years passed. The legend grew while the man remained quiet. Every now and then, someone new would ask the forbidden question, what if we try Harlem? The answer never changed. Ask Chicago how that worked out, and the conversation would end. The survivor, the one who came back, heard rumors years later that Capone had finally been arrested. He didn't celebrate. He poured a drink and stared out at the water, because he knew something the newspapers never would. Capone had already lost before the handcuffs. He'd learned the limit of violence, and limits are poison to men like him. Bumpy Johnson lived long enough to watch generations of criminals come and go. They changed styles, changed rules, changed names. Harlem didn't change. That was the real warning Capone received, and the one no one else ever needed repeated. You can conquer cities, but you cannot conquer places that remember who they are. Years later, when the city had learned new rhythms and new names replaced old ones, Ellsworth, Bumpy, Johnson sat alone in a quiet room above Lenox Avenue and thought about the night Chicago came calling. Not with pride, with clarity. Power, he had learned, was not about how loudly you announce yourself. It was about how many decisions happened without you needing to be present. By the time men argued about whether Harlem could be taken, the answer had already been delivered decades earlier, without headlines, without bodies, without a war anyone could point to. 30 men had tried to force the issue. One man had returned to explain why force was the wrong language. That lesson aged better than bullets ever do. By then, Al Capone had become history, his name a cautionary tale, his legend flattened into anecdotes and caricature. The newspapers remembered the trials, the jokes, the spectacle. The underworld remembered something else. They remembered the first time Capone chose not to escalate. They remembered the file marked Harlem that never reopened. They remembered that even giants learned to step around certain shadows. Bumpy never wrote memoirs, never gave interviews, never corrected the stories. He understood that once a warning becomes common knowledge, it loses its edge. So he let the myths contradict each other. Some said Harlem was defended by hundreds of gunmen. Others swore it was cursed. A few insisted it was all exaggeration. He never confirmed or denied any of it, because the truth was simpler and far more dangerous. Harlem didn't need defending anymore. It had been decided. The survivor lived out his days quietly. No grand redemption arc. No dramatic confession. Just a man who carried a memory that weighed more than any crime he'd committed. Every time he heard someone talk about power, about dominance, about making an example, he thought of that night, the calm voices, the absence of panic, the way death felt administrative. Not angry, final. And he understood, then, what most men never do. Violence is loud. Control is silent. Bumpy Johnson died knowing something rare, that his greatest act wasn't something he did publicly, but something he prevented. A war that never happened. A massacre that never made the papers. A city that kept breathing because someone understood where to draw a line and how to make it permanent. The warning he sent back to Chicago was never repeated. It didn't need to be, because everyone who mattered learned it by watching what didn't happen next. That is how Harlem became untouchable, not through fear, through inevitability. And that is why, long after the men involved were gone, the rules still held, unspoken, unquestioned, and undefeated. Some places don't belong to outsiders. Some warnings are delivered only once.